This Czechoslovakian story is called Long, Broad, and Sharpsight. There was once a king who had only one son, and him he loved better than anything in the world. Even better than his own life. The king's greatest desire was to see his son married, but though the prince had traveled in many lands and seen many noble, beautiful ladies, there was not one among them all whom he wished to have for his wife. Hello, Kyrex says, honestly, I may pick up a copy of that. I love old literature with that bunch of stuff in it. Yeah, this old book is a specific edition. This is the second edition. There are many. This was the same edition that my mother read to me when I was a child. She read me these bedtime stories. One day the king called his son to him and said, "My son, for a long time now I have hoped to see you choose a bride, but you have desired no one. Take now this silver key, go to the top of the castle, and there you will see a steel door. This key will unlock it. Open the door and enter. Look carefully at everything in the room, and then return and tell me what you have seen. But whatever you do, do not touch or draw aside the curtain that hangs at the right of the door. If you should disobey me and do this thing, you will suffer the greatest dangers and may even pay for it with your life." The prince wondered greatly at his father's words, but he took the key and went to the top of the castle, and there he found the steel door his father described. He unlocked it with the silver key, stepped inside, and looked about him. When he had done so, he was filled with amazement in what he saw. The room had 12 sides, and on 11 of these sides there were pictures of 11 princesses, more beautiful than any the prince had ever seen in all his life before. Moreover, these pictures... Excuse me, let me clear my throat. Touch nothing but the lamp. Yeah, I know, right? What he saw... No. The prince? No. Moreover, these pictures were as though they were alive. They're big computer screens. When the prince looked at them, they moved and smiled and blushed and beckoned to him. He went from one to the other, and they were so beautiful that each one he looked upon seemed lovelier than the last. But, lovely though they were, there was not one of them whom the prince wished to have for a wife. Last of all, the prince came to the 12th side of the room. It was covered over with a curtain, and the curtain was of velvet, richly embroidered with gold and precious stones. The prince stood before it and looked at it, and looked at it. He tried to peer under its edges, but he could see nothing. Never in all his life had he longed for anything as he longed to lift that curtain and see what was behind it. I think mostly because he was told, "Bruh, don't do it." At last his longing grew so great that he could withstand it no longer. He laid his hand upon the folds and drew it aside, and when he had done so, his heart melted within him for love and joy. for there was a portrait of a maiden so fair and lovely that all the other 11 beauties, there was nothing beside her. The prince stood and looked at her, and she looked back at him. And she did not blush or beckon to him as the others had done, but rather she grew pale. "Yes," said the prince at last, "you and you only shall be my bride, even though I should have to go to the ends of the world to find you." When he said that, the picture bowed its head gravely. Then the prince dropped the curtain and left the room and went down to where the old king was waiting for him. As soon as he came before his father, the old man asked whether he had found the room and entered it. "I did," answered the prince. "And what did you see in the room, my son?" "I saw a picture of the maiden whom I wished to have for a wife." "And which of the 11 was it?" "It was none of the 11. It was the 12th, she whose portrait hangs behind the curtain." When the king heard this, he gave a cry of grief. "Alas, alas, my son, what have you done? Did I not warn you not to lift the curtain and not look behind it?" "You warned me, my father, and yet I could not. But look, and now I have seen the only one whom I will ever marry. Tell me, I pray of you, who is she, that I may go in search of her?" "Hello, Abby." "Well, did I know that misfortune would come upon you if ever you entered that room? Well, did I know that misfortune would come upon you if ever you entered that room? That princess whom you have seen is indeed the most beautiful princess in all the world. But she is also the most unfortunate. Because of her beauty, she was carried away by a wicked and powerful magician who wished to marry her. To this, however, she would not consent. He still keeps her a prisoner in an iron castle far away beyond the forest, plain, and mountain, at the very end of the world. Many princes and heroes and brave men have tried to rescue her, but none has ever succeeded. They have lost their lives in the attempt, and the magician has turned them all into stone statues to adorn his castle. And now you are determined to throw away your life also." And the book should be like, "Oh yeah, no, it's not even that big a deal. Yeah, you're right. Let's not do that. Let's just pick number 11, I guess." But no, that's not what it says. "That may be so," said the prince, "and yet it may also be that I may have succeeded even though others have failed. At any rate, I must try, or I cannot live without her." I haven't been able to sleep, hoping you're the magic trick I need. Thank you, Abby. Thank you for being here. When the king found that his son was determined to go, and that nothing could stay him, he gave him a bejeweled sword and the finest steel steed in his stable, and bade him good speed. Now, the thing I like about this story is the son disobeyed the father, but then after learning so, and after expressing his true desire and his dream to his father supported him and said, "Well, if you must go, if this is what you want, I'm going to give you the tools that just might get you through it." And I think that's, I don't know, a lesson in itself right there. I think we should be more supportive of people who have made a decision, even if we don't agree with that decision. If it's already been made, support them. They know that you disapprove, but can't change that anymore. They've already done it. Anyway, so the prince set out with his father's blessing, and he rode along until at last he came to a forest that was so vast there seemed to be no end to it. In this forest, he quite lost his way. He was therefore very glad when he saw someone trudging along in front of him. The prince rode on until he overtook the man, and then he reined in his horse and bade him good day. Good day, answered the man. Do you know the way through this forest? Asked the prince. No, I know nothing about them, but that never bothers me. At any time I think I am going the wrong direction, it's easy to right myself. How's that? Asked the prince. Oh, I have the power of stretching myself out to any length, and if I lose my way, I have only to make myself tall enough to see over the treetops, and then I can easily tell where I am. That must be very curious. I should like to see that, said the prince. Well, that was easy enough, and the man would be glad enough to oblige him, so he began to stretch himself, and thus Slender Man was born. No. He stretched and stretched and stretched until he was taller than the tree and all of the tallest trees in the forest. His head and his body were quite lost to sight among the branches, and all that the prince could see were his legs and feet. Lily asks, no, Lily says, but never spoke to her, so now, how does he know he wants to marry her? You're right, he doesn't, because he's a man, men don't know nothing. Again, I'm falling in love with her, but once gets to know her, but just by the portrait. Yeah, just by the portrait. He's very superficial. Let's see, where was I in this book? I was trying to remember. Stretched. Okay. All I could see was his feet. Is that enough? The man called down to the prince. Yes, that is enough, answered the prince, and he had to shout to make himself heard. The man's head was so far away. Let's try that again. Is that enough? The man called down to the prince. Yes, that is enough, answered the prince, and he had to shout to make himself heard. The man's head was so far away. Then the man began to shrink. He shrank and shrank and shrank until he was no taller than the prince himself. Hello, TMC Leo. Good to see you. You are a wonderful fellow, and the prince... You are a wonderful fellow, said the prince. And what is your name? The man's name was Long. And what did you see up there? I saw a plain and great mountains beyond, and still beyond that was an iron castle. And it was so far away that it must be at the very end of the world. Is that the castle? That is the is that? It is that castle that I am seeking, said the prince. And now I see that you are the very man to guide me there. Tell me, Long, will you take service with me? If you will, I will pay you well. Yes, Long would do that, and not for the sake of the money either, but because he had taken a fancy to the prince. So the prince and his new servant traveled along together, and presently they came out of the forest onto the plain, and there, far in front of them, was another man also traveling along toward the mountains. Look, master, said Long, do you see that man? His name is Broad. You ought to have him for your servant too. for he is even more wonderful than I am. Call him then, said the prince, and I will speak with him. No, Long could not call him, for Broad was too far away to hear him, but he could soon overtake him, so Long stretched himself out until he was tall enough to go half a mile at every step. In this way he soon overtook Broad and stopped him. And then he and Broad waited until the prince had caught up to them. Good day, said the prince to Broad. Good day, answered Broad. My servant here tells me that you are a very wonderful person, said the prince. What can you do that is so wonderful? And Broad said, I can solve a Rubik's Cube in less than 30 seconds. And the prince said, You're fired, Long. You said he was awesome. That didn't happen. What Broad could do was to spread himself out so he was broad across as he wished to be. I would like to see that, said the prince. Very well, nothing was easier, and Broad was willing to show him. But first, said Broad, do you get behind these rocks over yonder, otherwise you may get hurt. And now I will begin. Quick, quick, master, cried Long, in a voice of fear. Let's see if I can do it. Quick, quick, master, cried Long in a voice of fear. We have not a moment to lose. Is that the fear voice? Is that, hey, what's up, Johnny Cox? What's good? What's good? What's good? We have not a moment to lose, and he ran full speed and crouched behind the rocks. The prince followed him, and he also got behind the rocks, but he did not know why Long was in such a hurry, nor why he seemed so frightened. He soon saw, however, for when Broad began to spread, he spread so fast and with such force that unless the prince and Long had been back behind the rocks, they would certainly have been pushed against them and crushed. Is that enough? Cried Broad, after he had spread out so wide that the prince could scarcely see across him. Yes, that is enough. So Broad began to shrink, and soon he was no fatter than he had been before. Yes, you are certainly a very wonderful fellow, and I should like to have you for me as my servant, said the prince. Will you come with me also? Yes, Broad would come, for a master who was good enough for Long was good enough for him too. So now the prince had two servants. He rode across the plain. Towards the mountains, and the two followed him. After a while, they came to a man sitting by the way with a bandage over his eye. The prince stopped and spoke to him. Are you blind, my poor fellow, that you wear a bandage on your eyes? No, answered the man. I'm not blind. I wear the bandage because I see too well without it. Even now, with this bandage, I can see as clearly as you ever can. If I take it off, I can see hundreds of miles, and when I look at anything steadily, my sight is so strong that the thing is riven into pieces or bursts into flames and is burned. Okay, so Cyclops, right? We're talking about Cyclops right now. From X-Men. That is a very curious thing, said the prince. Could you break yonder rocks into pieces by only looking at it? Yes, I can do that. I would like to see it, said the prince. Well, the man was ready to oblige him, so he took the bandage from his eyes and fixed his gaze on the rocks. The first rock grew hot, then it smoked, and then, with a great noise, it shattered into bits. so the pieces flew about through the air. "Yes, you are even more wonderful than these other two," said the prince. And then the other two said, "Well, I don't think I'm that bad. I mean, geez." "And they are wonderful enough. How are you called?" "My name is Sharpsight." "Well, Sharpsight, will you take service with me? For I need just such a servant as you." Yes, Sharpsight would do that. And now the prince had 3 servants, and they were such servants as no one in the world had ever had before. The way they write in this olden way is so confusing. They traveled along over the plain, and at last they came to the foot of the mountain that lay between them and the iron castle. "Now we must either go over it or around it," said the prince. "Which shall it be?" "No need for that, master," answered Sharpsight. "Let me just unbandage my eyes, but be careful you are not struck by any of the flying pieces when the mountain begins to split." So the prince and Broad and Long took shelter back behind the clump of trees, and then Sharpsight covered his eyes. He fixed his eyes on the mountain. Hang on. Johnny Cox, I hope you feel better. Hello, Leroy. Welcome in. Good to see you. Where was I? Yes. Let me just unbandage my eyes. When the mountain began to split. Okay. They took shelter back behind the clump of trees, and then Sharpsight covered his eyes. He fixed his eyes on the mountain, and presently it began to groan and split and splinter. Pieces of sharp rock and stones flew through the air. It was not long before Sharpsight's gaze had bored a way straight through the mountain and out on the other side. Then he put back the bandage over his eyes and called to the prince that the way was clear. The prince and his companions came out from their shelter, and when they saw the way that Sharpsight had made through the mountain, they could not wonder enough. It was so broad and clear that 10 men could have ridden through it abreast. With such a way before them, it did not take long to go through the mountain, and then they found themselves in the country beyond. And a black and terrible land it was, too. Nowhere was there any sound or sign of life. There were fields, but no grass. There were trees, but they bore neither leaves nor fruit. There was a river, but it did not flow. And there was light, yet they saw no sun. But darker and gloomier than all the rest was the castle which rose before them. It was the iron castle where the black magician lived. They don't mean black, like skin tone, by the way. Just saying. Probably wears black. There was a moat around the castle, and an iron bridge across it. The companions rode across the bridge, and no sooner were they over the bridge, no sooner than the bridge rose behind them, and they were prisoners. And like the bridge to the across the moat, you understand? You understand? They were trapped. They were prisoners. They could not have turned back even if they wished to do so, but none of them had any thought of such a thing. The prince struck with his sword upon the great door of the castle, and at once it opened before him. But when he entered, he saw no one. Before him was a great hall, and on either side of it was a long row of stone figures. These statues were all figures of knights and kings and princes. The prince looked at them and wondered, for they were so exactly like life that it seemed scarcely possible to believe that they were only stone. He and his companions went on farther into the castle, and everywhere they found rooms, magnificently furnished, but silent and deserted. Nowhere was there any sign of life. Last of all, they entered what seemed to be a dining hall. There was a table set with the most delicious things to eat and drink. There was a table set with the most delicious things to eat and drink. There were 4 places about the table, and one of them was somewhat higher than the others, as though intended for a prince or a king. One might think this table had been set for us, said the prince. We will wait for a while, and then if no one comes, we will eat it at any rate. They waited for some time and then took their place at the table. At once, invisible hands filled with goblets and other invisible hands passed. At once, invisible hands filled the goblets, and other invisible hands passed the dishes. The prince and his companions ate and drank all that they wished, and then they rose from the table, meaning to look farther through the castle. At this moment, the door opened, and a tall man with a long gray beard came into the room. From head to foot, he was dressed entirely in black velvet, even to his cap and shoes, and around the middle of his robe was fastened with 3 iron bands. In one hand was an ivory wand, curiously carved. With the other, he led a lady so beautiful and yet so pale and sad-looking that the heart ached to look at her. The moment the prince saw her, he knew her as the one whose picture he had seen behind the golden curtain, the one whom he had said he should be his bride. The magician, for it was he, spoke at once to the prince. I know why you have come here, and that you hope to win this princess for your bride. Many others have come here with the same wish and have failed. Now you shall have your turn. For 3 nights you must watch here. For 3 nights you must watch here with her. If for 3 mornings I return and find her still with you, then you shall have her for a bride. But if she is gone, you shall have turned to stone and into a stone statue, such as those you've already seen about my place. So you just gotta stay with her all night and not let her leave? That ought not to be a hard task, said the prince. Gladly I will watch with her for 3 nights. If in the morning you find her gone, I am willing to suffer whatever you will, but my 3 companions must watch here with me. Yes, the magician was willing to agree to that, so he left the lady with the boar, and then went away, closing the door behind him. She's a prisoner. Yeah. As soon as the magician had gone, the prince and his followers made ready to guard the room so that no one entered, so that no one could come in and take the lady away, nor could she herself leave without their knowing it. Long lay down and stretched himself out until he encircled the whole room, and anyone who went in or out would have to step over him. Hey, doorbell Ron. Yeah, what's up? Sharpsight sat down to watch while Broad stood at the doorway and made himself so broad that no one could possibly have squeezed past him. Meanwhile, the prince tried to talk to the lady, but she would not look at him or answer him. In this way, some time passed, and then suddenly the prince began to feel very drowsy. He tried to rouse himself, but in spite of his efforts, his eyes closed and he fell into a deep sleep. It was not until the early morning that he woke. Then he roused himself and looked about him. His companions, too, were only just opening their eyes, for they, like himself, had been asleep, and the lady was gone from the room. When the prince saw this, he began to groan and lament, but his companions told him not to despair. "Wait until I see if I can tell you where she is," said Sharpsight. He leaned from the window. And looked about. "Yes, I see her," he said. 100 miles away from here is a forest. In that forest is an oak tree. On the topmost bough of the oak tree is an acorn, and in that acorn is the princess hidden. Sharpsight, if this weren't a fairy tale, I wouldn't believe you. The book name is called Anthology of Children's Literature, and this story is a Czechoslovakian tale called Long, Broad, and Sharpsight. But what good is it to know where she is unless we can get her back here before the magician comes?" cried the prince. "It would take us days to journey there with no return." "Not so long as that, master," answered Long. Have patience. Have patience for a moment until I can see what I can do." He then stepped outside and made himself so tall that he could go 10 miles at a step. He set Sharpsight on his shoulder to show him the way, and away he went. He made such good time that he was back in the castle again before the prince could have walked 3 times around the room. "Here, master," he said, "here is the acorn. Take it and throw it upon the floor." The prince threw the acorn upon the floor, and at once it flew open, and there stood the princess before him. Hardly had this happened when the door opened and the magician came into the room. When he saw the princess, he gave a cry of rage, and one of the iron bands around his middle broke with a loud noise. "Hey yo, Link, what's up?" He looked at the prince and his eyes flashed as if with red fire. This time you have succeeded in keeping the princess with you, he cried. But do not be too sure that you can do the same thing again. Tonight you shall try once more. So, saying, he went away, taking the princess with him, and in the evening he came again, and again he brought the princess. Watch her well, he said to the prince, with an evil smile. Remember, if she is not still here, tomorrow morning you will share the fate of the others who have tried to watch her and have failed. Very well, said the prince. What must be, and I can only do my best. The magician then went away, leaving the princess with them as before. The prince and his companions had determined that this night they would stay awake, whatever happened. But presently their eyelids grew as heavy as lead, and soon, in spite of themselves, they all fell into a deep sleep. When they awoke, the day was breaking and the princess had disappeared. The prince was ready to tear his hair with despair. Did they have to choose those words? He was ready to tear his hair with despair. Beware. Oh, sure, when the prince traps you for 3 days, it's romantic. But when I do it, I'm evil. It's funny. What must be. The princess had disappeared. The prince was ready to tear out his hair with despair, but Sharpsight bade him take heart. Wait until I take a look about, he said. If I cannot see her, then it will be time for you to despair. Spooky Lens, hello, what's up, what's good? He leaned from the window, and first he looked east, then he looked west, and then he looked off toward the north. Yes, now I see her, he said, but she is far enough away. 200 miles from here is a desert. In that desert is a rock, in that rock is a golden ring, and that ring is the princess. Not in that, just that ring is a princess. Okay, sure. That is far away indeed, groaned the prince. And at any moment the magician may be here to look for her. Never mind, master, cried Long. 200 miles is not far when one can go 20 miles at a step. Then he made himself twice as tall as the day before, and taking Sharpsight on his shoulders, he set out for the desert. It was not long before he was back again, and in his hand he carried the golden ring. If it had not been for Sharpsight, he said, I would have been forced to bring back the whole rock with me, but he fixed his eyes upon it, and at once it split into 1,000 pieces, and the ring fell out. Here, take the ring, master, quick, throw it upon the floor. The prince did so, and as soon as the ring touched the ground, it was transformed into the princess. Checking in the UK. Thank you, Spooky Lens. You want to take a look at the globe while I do this? We gotta give it a second for it to reload. Or maybe I'm gonna do it like this. There we go. Just like that. And just like that, it turned into a princess. this moment the magician opened the door and came into the room. When he saw the princess, he stopped short, and his face turned black with rage and fear. At the same moment, the second band around his middle flew apart. "Ah, well," cried the magician to the prince. "No doubt you think you are very clever, but remember, there is still another night, and this time, Gadget, you will not prove so lucky in keeping the princess with you. I'll get you next time, Gadget. Next time." Yeah, no, not red with rage, black with rage. He skipped red. He was so mad that his face just turned freaking into coal. Alright. And this time, Skywalker, you may not prove so lucky in keeping the princess with you. The dark side of the Force. Alright, anyway, enough messing around. This is a serious story here. We gotta get through it. So saying, he went away with the princess, and the prince saw him no more until the evening. Then, for the third time, he came and brought the princess with him. "Watch her well," said he, "for I promise you will not have so easy a task this time as you had before." Then he went away, and the four comrades set themselves to watch the princess. But this time, all happened just as it had before. In spite of themselves, they could not stay awake. Oh, that's because they were listening to ASMR on Twitch.tv. What? Or maybe they were watching Bowman-Dean's YouTube channel on YouTube. They were probably subscribed. They probably liked the video, and they went right to sleep. First they nodded, and then they snored, and then they fell into such a deep sleep that if the walls had fallen about them, they would not have known it, for this was an enchanted sleep. Ha! That's the answer. An enchanted sleep that the magician had thrown upon them in order to take away the princess. Not till day began to dawn did the four awake, and when they did, there was nothing to be seen of the princess. "Well, she is not here in the room," said Sharpsight. And then the other turned to him and said, "Yeah, no duh, Dick Tracy. We can see that for ourselves." Then he said, "So methinks I'd better look outside." "Yeah, you do that, Captain Obvious." Then he leaned from the window, and for a long time he looked about him. At last he spoke. "Master, I see the princess, but to bring her back here would not be such an easy task as it was before. 300 miles from here is a sea. At the bottom of the sea is a shell. In that shell is a pearl, and that pearl is the princess. But to bring that pearl up from the sea is a task for Broad, as well as Long." "Very well," said the prince. "Then Long must take Broad with him on one shoulder. Only make haste and go and return in heaven's name, for the magician may be here before you can fetch her and turn us all into stone." Well, the three servants were willing enough to be off. Long stretched himself out until he was 3 times as tall as he had been the first time, and that was the most he could stretch. Then away he went, 30 miles at a step. At each rate, it was no time before he came to the sea. The sea was fathoms deep, and the shell lay at the very bottom of it. And try as he might, he could not reach it. "Now it is my turn," said Broad. "Now it is my turn," said Broad. There we go. Then he lay down and put his mouth into the sea and began to drink. He drank and drank and drank, and swelled until it was wonderful to see him. And in the end he swallowed so much of the water that it was easy enough for Long to reach down and pick up the shell. "And now we must haste," cried Sharpsight, "for as I look back at the castle I see the magician is already awakening." At once Long took his companions on his shoulders and started back the way they had came. But Broad had drunk so much water, and he was so heavy that Long could not go as fast as he otherwise would. "Broad, you will have to wait here, and I will come back for you later," he cried. And with that he threw Broad down from his shoulder, and though he had been, as though he had been a sack full of grain. Broad had not been expecting such a fall and was not prepared for it. He gasped and choked, and the sea he had swallowed rose all around them. It filled the valley and washed up over the foot of the mountains. Long was so tall that he was able to wade out of it, though the water was up to his waist, and Sharpsight, too, was safe, for he was on Long's shoulder. But Broad was like to have drowned. He only saved himself by catching hold of Long's hand, and so he was drawn out of the water up onto dry land. "That was a pretty quick trick to play on me," he gasped and sputtered. But Long, no time to answer him, for already Sharpsight was whispering in his ear that the magician had awakened and was now on his way to the prince. He caught Broad by the belt, swung him up over the shoulder, and this he could easily do, because now Broad was so shrunken and he was quite light. "Hey, what's up, Megan? Good to see you. Good to see you, Megan. Rebel Stardust, hello." In 2 more steps, Long reached the castle, but already the magician was opening the door of the chamber where the prince was. "Quick, quick," cried Sharpsight. "Throw this pearl in at the window." And indeed there was no time to be lost. Long threw the pearl through the window, and the moment it touched the floor it turned into the princess. She stood there before the prince, no longer pale and sad, but smiling, as rosy as the dawn. Already the magician was in the room, with an evil smile upon his face. When he saw the princess standing there, he gave a cry so loud and terrible that the whole castle shook with it, and now the 3rd iron band that was around his waist broke. At once, the black velvet robe that had been held about him with the bands rose and spread into great black wings. His eyes shrank, his nose grew long and sharp, and instead of the magician, there was a great black raven in the room with them. Heavily flapping, it rose from the ground. 3 times round the room it flew, croaking mournfully, and then out through the window. And now through all the castle arose a stir and hum of life. The stone figures in the hall stirred and looked about them and stepped down, no longer cold dead stone, but living, breathing people. And they were those who had come to the castle in search of the princess, and they had been bewitched by the magician and turned into statues. Now the evil charm was broken, and they were alive once more. When they found it was the prince and his followers who had done this, they did not know how to thank them enough. They could not even grudge the princess to the prince, for it was he who had brought them back to life. They all said they would return with the prince to his own country, so as to be at the wedding when he was married to the princess. The end. They also lived happily ever after for most of their lives. This has been Long, Broad, and Sharpsight, a Czechoslovakian folk tale from the book Anthology.